Luke, you must use the Force.
Hi, I'm Mike Hogue here with Esmeralda Zelda the Illuminator, or as we like to call her, the Kitten. And today we're going to tell you about how we use permaculture and systems thinking to weed in our garden. You see, as a permaculture designer, people often ask me, and the Kitten, how it is that we weed our garden. What techniques do we use? And they expect me to say things like I use flame weeding, or maybe I make my own KNF weeding spray, a homemade herbicide, or something like that. But you see, when you understand the true esoteric permaculture and can apply systems thinking, you don't have to use any techniques to weed, because we can weed like Jedis with our minds. This is the kind of monstrosity you get, by the way, when you ask one of the AI art generators to make a picture of weeding like a Jedi for you. I want to talk to you about how I have used these techniques of permaculture and systems thinking to create and maintain a large, full-time production garden that has fed a complete diet to my household and family and provided a lot of extras for income over the year on an acre at home, and actually in a much larger area than that as well. And not only that, but with this kind of weeding, you see, people often think that permaculture, either they think I'm making a bunch of like KNF sprays and spraying, or they think that my yard must just be a totally weedy mess and I don't care about weeds. Whereas the exact opposite is true. You know, weeds are an important issue if you really care about having a high productivity garden. If you don't manage weeds in the garden and you're competing with weeds, it's just a proven fact that your yields are going to be low. So it's important to be able to manage weeds. But this is the thing. I still spend so little time weeding that I'm able to manage this large landscape, have it generate an income for me and a complete diet for the family on just a few hours of work per week. And I tend to do literally just a couple of hours total of weeding all season long, of any kind of work that could be considered weeding, because I weed with my mind. And so when I say that sort of thing, another thing people might think is that I'm only harvesting and eating a bunch of weeds from my garden. And because they would be right. If you do normal gardening and you don't do anything for weeds, you will mostly be harvesting weeds, because the weeds will kill your garden. Whereas I harvest and have a ton of different varieties of fruits and vegetables, just some ideas of daily yields over the season. As you can see, it produces all the normal things that a nice full-time sort of CSA garden might produce. In the course of the season, I'm just not having to do much weeding because I've used a strategy of permanent transformation of the landscape. As you can see here, because I'm spending so little time doing weeding work, I'm able to really transform the landscape from this into that. And so one of the biggest tools that we'll use to make this happen is a theory that really inspired permaculture's founders, Bill Mollison and David Holmgren. It came from Donella Meadows, the systems thinker. And these are Donella Meadows' systems leverage points for intervening in complex systems. Now remember, when we're talking about complex systems, that could be our bodies, it could be the economy, it could be the whole global climate, it could be our garden, or our soil, or our health. So I've done videos before in the past that you can look at explaining systems theory in a little more detail, talking about how we can use it for our health and how we can use it to solve the ecological crisis. Today I want to tell you about how to use this kind of thinking tool for weeding. And this is a tool that's really common in some permaculture design communities, not all of them, but to me, this is the real and most powerful permaculture of all once we start thinking this way. Because now the whole point of it is that we usually focus in on things that are ineffective and cause a lot of violence. And instead, it helps us find a strategy that requires a lot less energy, less violence, and is far more effective. So let's take a look at how we can apply this thinking to weeds. And if you want to go deeper on it, check out my other videos on this topic. So here we have it. Another Meadows, places to intervene in complex systems. Now, Meadows identified 12 to 13 places we can intervene in a system, but I've limited this down to simplify things to 4 places. If you want an in-depth view, you can go and look at my other videos. Now, these places include brute force methods, measuring numbers and trying to directly change them, and then we can move up in leverage to changing behaviors, changing the behaviors that drive the numbers. We can change systems, or we can do what we can call deep change, changing the paradigms that created the systems in the first place, or even transcending those whole paradigms. And as you see here, this whole thing looks like a giant lever that we can use to change the complex system. And this tells us that these 4 places have different amounts of leverage. You see, on the bottom left, you see, it's really easy to reach up there and grab this lever with the brute force methods. So these are the things we normally think of. For example, if we want to lose weight, we count calories, or we think we want to stop eating so much junk food. So it means we're measuring numbers and then trying to directly change them. So we're quantifying how much junk food we're eating, then just eat less of that. So there are 2 big problems with this. One, we know that brute force methods are rarely very effective. One, because complex systems just don't act the way we think they're going to act. We try to get one result, and we get another result. For example, when we just diet too much, we can actually put our metabolisms into a space where we're conserving more energy. We get really tired and sluggish, so we're less physically active, and so we end up burning fewer calories. So when the diet comes to the end, our metabolisms are down, and all the fat comes back only with extra. We end up fatter than when we started. And so brute force methods just rarely work very well at all. And then the other problem with them is that they tend to involve so much energy that it gets interpreted as violence in a lot of ways. For example, if there's a piece of cake over there and I want to eat that piece of cake, I'm going to interpret it as violence if I'm forcing myself to not eat that cake. And if I'm taking the cake away from you, because I don't want you to gain weight, then you'll interpret that as violence. So brute force methods are ineffective, and they tend to be kind of violent, and yet these are the places where we almost always focus, as we'll see. So as we move up in leverage, we end up with things that are far more effective, and because they require so much less energy, they're also far less violent. The problem with them is, it's really hard to reach up there and figure out how to grab a hold of that lever. In other words, if we can grab the lever, they have a big impact for change, lasting change. But it's harder to figure out how to intervene in them. You see, we have to think about it. We can't just get out there and do something, right? We can't just don't just sit there, do something. We have to do the opposite. We have to don't just do something, sit there, think about it, come up with a good plan. Because if we have a good plan, and a lot of times that means we also need to collaborate. We need helpers down there to make it work. We've got to have cooperation in what we're trying to do, and we have to have a system that will allow us to gain leverage to that. But once we can have a big impact on these systems. So let's go back and talk about the bottom left, the lowest leverage point we can, these brute force methods. These are easy to figure out how to do. And so it's what we almost always focus on. Again, even when we're talking about permaculture, when people ask about weeding in permaculture communities, people immediately go to what kind of poisons are better to spray. People will talk about switching to things like Epsom salt or salt or vinegar or urine in order to do spray, to just spray poisons. The problem is, again, we have this whole idea, we're measuring numbers and trying to directly change them, and spraying any kind of poison is going to be counterproductive to overall system health. Even if they're homemade poisons, like KNF poisons, they're still going to potentially damage non-target organisms, they're going to hurt the soil biology, and they're going to be counterproductive to our goal of a healthy ecosystem. But even that is a step up from the lowest leverage point we have, which is just counting and measuring numbers. Because this is almost always where we start. And for weeding, that means you see the weeds, you see there are too many of them, and you get stressed out about that. Well, getting stressed out about the weeds doesn't actually cause there to be any fewer weeds, right? So we have to start taking some kind of action against weeds. And that could be spraying poisons. Maybe we move up from there to flame weeding, although this also can harm the soil biology. Another problem with it is, again, it's just ineffective because you have not changed the fundamental dynamics of an ecosystem. The ecosystem is always going to want to cover bare soil. It's always going to, so if you flame weed and recreate bare soil, you're going to have more weeds. All of these techniques, like hand weeding, you get in there and you hand weed, the weeds are coming back. So the thing to remember with brute force methods for weeding is that when you use brute force to solve the problem in the garden, you have worked brute force forever into your system. You have made hand weeding part of your garden design, and you will forever, every year, be doing hand weeding or flame weeding or spraying poisons, right? So this is why they're ineffective and they just cause us to do more work. When you pull a weed is coming back again and again and again because you have recreated the ecosystem that the weed flourished in the first place. Now look over that way towards the top. We're starting to get to a whole new type of brute force method with spot mulching. This means I can take a pizza box, throw it over the weeds I want to cover up if they're a small area, and throw some mulch on top of there. Now I've done the weeding, but I've also changed the ecosystem. So so now there's no longer bare soil for the weed to come back. This is still a brute force method where I'm hand dealing with weeds, but it's a very high leverage one that's starting to move us into a higher leverage point that's going to be far more powerful. So next up, here we go. Now we're starting to get to the true powerful Jedi methods for weeding. Now this Jedi here, this AI Jedi gardener has a very interesting weeding tool and very interesting anatomy if you look closely too, not too closely, it's kind of creepy. It'll creep me out if that stays on the screen too long. So now we're going to get up to a higher leverage point, changing behaviors. Now for gardening, this means there are a few different ways we can talk about changing behaviors. We can change our own behaviors for how we're weeding. For example, instead of pulling a weed, we can use spot mulching, right? Instead, another behavior is whenever you pull a weed, you can put a new seed in there. You can put a new plant in there so that you're changing the system with your behavior. Instead of just pulling that weed so another weed is going to come back, you put in a seed there, put in a new plant, and now you've chosen what's going to fill that niche instead of the weed just coming back. Another thing that we can do is intervene in plant cycles. For example, if we know that weeds are going to seed and we can prevent them by deadheading. Or we can look at grass and the behaviors of grass. Grasses have certain season when they encroach in the garden. So instead of trying to weed them out of the garden all year long, if we can make one timed intervention, it can keep grass out of the garden all season long. And then, most powerful of all, we can change our own behaviors that are causing the weeds in the first place. The biggest one is to stop tilling. Whenever we till or dig the garden, we are creating exactly the ecosystem that weeds are going to thrive in. If you have a garden that's based on tilling and digging every year you're going to have to deal with weeding. But if you can switch and stop tilling and stop digging, then you will have far few weeds. Another thing is that we can stop using liquid fertilizers, even if they're homemade fertilizers like KNF sprays or compost tea or comfrey tea. Even those, the research shows, are going to cause pest problems for one, and they're going to cause weed problems. Because a lot of the species that evolved as weeds evolved to turn that easy nitrogen into fast growth and outcompete our vegetables and our produce that we're trying to grow. So, and then that fertilizer doesn't even go to where we want it to go. It goes to feed weeds and make our lives harder. So if we can figure out systems for fertility so we can stop using liquid fertilizers, then we'll do a lot less weeding. That our behavior of using fertilizer is causing the weeds. Finally, we can move up here, there, and we can stop doing brute force weeding methods. Again, it's the brute force weeding methods that are causing a lot of the weeding issues. And when we can stop them, we end up having a lot fewer weeds to use. All right, and now we're going to start moving up to the most powerful levels of Jedi weeding, changing the whole system. For example, switching to learning a no-till type system. In a tillage garden, weeds are just part of the reality. But if we can switch to no-till systems, then we will find there are just fewer weeds. I have created no-till gardens that have lasted for 5-6 years or longer and required almost no weeding ever at all. And yet they remain productive, highly productive over a long period of time. We have to learn a no-till system. You have to switch to a new system. Now, so you know, there are 4 main systems for poison and plastic-free no-till. I do not recommend using plastic tarping and mulching, plastic mulches for no-till, because it's a fact they contaminate your food with high levels of phthalates and microplastics, and it creates very unhealthy produce. So we want to switch away from that too, but we have to learn a no-till system that is going to be safe and not have plastic contaminating our food. One of those is to use sheet mulching. That's where we use a cardboard layer and lots of mulch on top of it. And if we do that, we can have gardens that last a really long time. I'm going to tell you a little bit and show you some examples of these. We can use guilds, guilds are creating plant communities that work like natural plant communities. And we can actually recruit plants to do weeding work for us. For example, we can use fortress plants. Fortress plants will keep weeds out of the garden. We can use a guild matrix, which is a really powerful tool for reducing the number of weeds in the garden. And finally, we can move up again to really powerful systems like slash mulch, which I'll show you. A slash mulch system will pretty much eliminate weeding in the garden and and now we're getting up to really powerful forms of system change because they're bordering on paradigm shifts altogether. And so slash mulch could be nearly a paradigm shift. And then we could use something called Terminator guilds, which are guilds designed to do weeding for us. Let's take a look at some of these. Going back to the first of these, a sheet mulch system. This is just the way I tend to start almost all my gardens now. Here you can see the start of a garden at a new project site for me. Getting that cardboard down and then loads of mulch. The cardboard breaks down completely and goes bye-bye, so it's no longer there and leaves nothing but a nice, deeply mulched, clean planting surface for us. It's a great technique, and I have had, here's one that's a few years into a sheet mulch, like 3 years, again, it's spring. So you can see after 3 years, there's almost no weeds appearing at all in the system yet. And here, this is another place where I've done this. This was a garden that was started with sheet mulch, and this is what's called a guild. It's a natural plant community where all of these plants work together to almost be like an ecosystem. And this particular guild uses this other concept called the guild matrix, which uses specific plants in a combination to really dominate the landscape and make sure there's just no room for weeds. And the reality is, I've had them last for years and not require any weeding work. Think about that. So if you want to have a weed-free garden, you can design a garden that requires very little weeding. One of the techniques that we use for guilds, one type of plant, and just again to go back to this idea of guilds, it means we're trying to copy what happens in an ecosystem. And in most ecosystems, there are tight plantings, like in a guild matrix, that just keep weeds from really appearing in a healthy ecosystem. And the plant community usually has an edge sub-community, which keeps things like grasses out of it. We can use that ecological model, like you see here, where I have recruited a plant that can do weeding for me. And as you can see, the grass is not invading this garden bed. There's more of a threat that the garden is going to invade the lawn. A lot of people spend so much time keeping the grass from invading the garden, but we can design gardens that will actually keep the grass out. Here's one with a fortress planting of different fortress plants along the front of the garden, along the grassy edge. I always use this technique where my gardens are up against grass, because otherwise the grass is going to take over the garden. Everybody knows that. Or you got to continuously work to keep the grass out. But if you have this fortress planting, as you see, that grass is receding away from the garden along the whole bed, even in the spring during the time when grasses run the most. Here's another example from a garden where you can see in the bottom right, the garden is invading the lawn, not the other way around. That's the way I like it. You see, if I design a garden to work like this, then I do not have to work to keep the grass and weeds from invading the garden, because I have already done my weeding with my mind. Now, another technique we can use like this are Terminator guilds. A Terminator guild is a set of plants that we want to plant to actually transform a weedy area. People often ask me about like vinca and ivy. In my ecosystem, they can be really super aggressive and tough to get rid of. And people say, yeah, I can't do all this permaculture stuff. I've got to hand weed in my garden because I have vinca. Guess what? I have on multiple sites now created Terminator guilds that have completely eradicated. That's a lie, because I don't want to eradicate them. I don't have to. But it brings them under control. Here's the same area a few years later. As you can see, the vinca did not stop me from establishing a bunch of useful plants like the monarda up front and the groundnuts that you see growing through it. To the overstory and behind, there's all sorts of berries. There's quinces and currants. Quinces to the left, currants and gooseberries. The overstory that you see in the back are pawpaws. And I was able to establish all of these, even with vinca underneath. And in the spring, there's ramps, Claytonia virginica, Solomon seal, ostrich fern. This whole area is loaded with food-producing native plants, and I did not have to worry about the vinca. Guess what? There's still some vinca in there. In the spring, when this all dies back, you can see small patches of it here and there. I don't care. It's not bothering anything. It's not preventing me from growing a complete food forest and a complete lush, rich garden in that area. So it's not a problem. And here's another one. In this area, this is a nice Terminator guild that I planted with as a kind of guild matrix. And in this particular site, this Terminator guild actually replaced lawn. So I did not have to go in and till and or even sheet mulch here in order to remove the lawn. I planted a guild of plants that replaced that lawn over time with a productive, rich ecosystem. Now, and plant community. Now, if you look in there really carefully, you can still see a small couple of patches of some grass and a few isolated blades here and there. I did not completely eradicate the grass. I don't care, that's fine. The grass, as you can see, is no longer a problem in this garden. And this becomes a complete paradigm shift. Because if I'm gardening this way, I don't have to worry. I'm not worried about grass or weeds. I don't care. They can be in there if they want. All they do is add a little biodiversity because I'm not worried that they're going to take over this garden. And now we see the true power of a true permaculture perspective with this. That we're no longer even talking about what techniques to use for weeds, because weeds simply are no longer a problem in the garden. We've designed, the old paradigm was one of weeding, where weeds are simply a problem in gardens and we have to do weeding work of some way in order to control them. That may be weeding with sprays or weeding with our hands or a rototiller. There's some way in which we're doing weeding. But now we have transcended or switched to an entirely different paradigm. In this new paradigm, weeds might not even really exist. They're minimized down to such a point that they're simply not a problem, and we're doing very little in the way of work to control them. We have completely weeded weeding out of our garden with our minds, so that weeding isn't even part of it. And that brings us to the idea, the leverage point of deep change. Changing the paradigms that created the whole systems in the first place, or better yet, transcending those paradigms. Oh, to start with, one major paradigm change is permaculture zones. Probably the most powerful weeding tool I know of. And in permaculture zones, we reimagine the whole landscape. For example, with weeding, it means we can have one intensive area of our garden where we really want to keep all weeds out. And we can use a combination of sheet mulching to do that, or we can use maybe even hand weeding in a small area. Remember, once we have transformed the whole system, a little bit of brute force in the right place can be very effective. It's just the only problem with brute force methods are when they're all we're counting on, because then we just have too much work to do. But if we can limit down the amount of weeding that we have to do to a very small area, we hardly can see it as a problem anymore. So we may have one zone where we're doing some weeding. We have another zone where we're just controlling weeds with sheet mulch and fortress plants. A larger zone where maybe we're using Terminator guilds. And finally, we may have areas of the garden as it gets bigger where we simply have to ask, are weeds actually causing a problem here? And if they're not, then why do we care? In that case, in those broader areas, we may use those weeds for food, can be a solution. A lot of the things we call weeds are actually higher nutrient and have higher nutrient density than the vegetables we're growing. So we can value them for that. We can use weeds for ecological succession. See, a lot of times people will ask me, well, what cover crop am I going to use? Well, what do you have now? Well, it's just grass and weeds. Why can't they be your cover crop? What are you planning on doing with it? Well, nothing for the next 10 years, but I need a cover crop. Why? If you're not going to do anything for 10 years, let the weeds be the cover crop. Let the weeds do succession for you. They're going to build biodiversity, fast forward succession, build your soil just as well as any cover crop could. So why don't we put those weeds to work for us? If we do, are they even weeds anymore? And the weeds can be thought of as adding biodiversity to the garden too. A lot of things we call weeds, they feed our bees, they feed pollinators, they feed vespids that end up helping the garden. And with this kind of thinking, with zones and all this idea that we can use weeds, we start to get the whole idea of a forest garden, which transcends the whole normal gardening paradigm altogether. Is in a forest garden, we actually value the weeds and biodiversity and all of this for the holistic benefits that they bring to the system. We can start to include zones where we don't care about weeds at all. Like in this is a picture of a slash mulch field, which is a system where we actually use whatever is growing there, including weeds, to make mulch to grow other things in them. And as you see, these systems can end up having a lot of biodiversity all on their own. So the weeds are actually helping to make a highly productive garden. And this is the same area where corn and beans and squash and lots of garlic you can see there, borage, all sorts of plants have been grown in to that weedy field without having to ever till or sheet mulch or do anything to remove those weeds. We're just using them and planting right into them. Here we can see it at a different time of the year in a different angle where we can see lots of grass or lots of corn plants coming in and a Three Sisters garden being grown in slash mulch. And you can see in there, I haven't done anything to till it, anything to remove those grasses. I've just cut them, raked them into piles, and I'm growing the corn, beans, and squash right in those mulch piles. Slash mulch. I have lots of videos on that. So in this kind of system, there's not even a concept of weeds, right? We're using the weeds to grow the plants that we want to grow. If we're using things like Terminator guilds and slash mulch in a complete holistic system with zones, weeds don't even register as a problem anymore. And we'll spend very little time each year doing weeds while keeping weeds very well managed, because I have done the weeding in advance with this holistic system design and investing in permanent long-term transformation instead of investing my time in brute force methods to just do weeding. When we get that right, we have truly done our weeding like Jedi Masters with our mind.